We begin with 4 cups of all-purpose flour, a half a teaspoon of instant yeast, two teaspoons of salt. I'm using table salt here. You could also use kosher salt. After I mix the dry ingredients, I mix them around real well, make sure everything's mixed in. Next goes the 2 cups of water. This is room temperature. And then I mix everything. I use a rubber spatula when I do this. Some people use wood, or they'll use a handle of a wood spatula. I like to mix this in with a rubber spatula because I like to scrape everything off the sides of the bowl and mix this in really well. This is going to be a really wet dough, but after we mix this in here, we're going to let it sit for 18 to 24 hours, covered with plastic wrap, sitting at room temperature on the counter. So I'm just going to mix this the best that I could. I start from the edges as I'm mixing it in. I like to make sure everything's thoroughly mixed because I've found that if you have some flour mixed in there and it's not mixed in really well, it does kind of harden up a little bit on you. I need to scrape this dough off the spatula. I have a little bit more flour on the bottom here that I'm just trying to incorporate. I probably could have used a little bit more water. I just measure the best I could with the flour. I don't do it by weight when I make the no-knead dough. Alright, so that's all mixed. We're going to cover this with some plastic wrap. After the dough is covered, you're going to let it sit on the countertop for 18 to 24 hours. Okay, after the 18 to 24 hours, we're ready to put the dough in the pan. I'm using a smaller pan here that I grabbed by accident. Ideally you want to use a little slightly larger pan. I ran my plastic bowl scraper under some water. You could also use a rubber spatula. You can run that under water as well. It'll prevent the dough from sticking to it. You're going to work the dough out of the bowl, put it on top of the silicone mat that I have here on top of the pan, and we're going to spread the dough out in the pan. Since I have a smaller pan, the dough is going to take up most of the pan. It doesn't really have to go all the way to the edges if you're using something slightly larger. You wet your hands. If your hands are wet, just run them under some water. You can spread the dough out fairly easily, and the dough is not going to stick to your hands. Just spread the dough out as evenly as you can. After the dough is spread out in the pan, we're going to spray the top of the dough with some non-stick spray. We're going to cover it with plastic wrap. Spraying the dough with non-stick spray will really prevent the plastic wrap from sticking. We're going to let this dough sit about an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it'll rise slightly. It won't double in size, but it will rise a little bit more than it is right now. And here I'm preparing a second flatbread. Came up to temperature. I'm going to put it in the top rack, 350 degrees. I have another one that's going to go on the bottom, but we'll come back and check on that in a minute. Alright, so I have the dough here after it was rising for a couple of hours on the tray. I have the silicone mat underneath because it's a really wet dough, you don't want it to stick. I did the non-stick spray. The plastic wrap just comes right off. So the next thing I want to do is I want to put olive oil, coarse sea salt, and fresh rosemary on the dough, but what I do is I want to put little holes kind of in it so there's room for the oil and the rosemary to stay. So what I do is you wet your hands. So I'm going to rub my hands under some water. With your hands wet, it's not going to stick to the wet dough. You don't have to use oil, you could use water. And then I just take my fingertips and I poke at the dough, and this will leave a little indentation all along the dough. So once the dough is kind of indented, take the olive oil, drizzle the olive oil in here, and then I'll put the herbs on and the sea salt. This is fresh rosemary. Every time I make this, I'll do it with fresh rosemary. It's like a focaccia bread. You really can't beat the fresh herbs. It's much better than just using, dry rosemary. After I just chop this up, the whole kitchen just smells like rosemary, and it works really nice with the olive oil. Okay, I'm going to use some coarse sea salt. Now, when I made the dough, I put 2 teaspoons of salt in the dough. You could just put 1 teaspoon of salt in the dough if you're going to, depending on how much sea salt you're going to sprinkle on top. You don't want it to be too salty. It really just depends on whatever your individual diet is. I did 2 teaspoons. I'm still going to put some of the coarse salt on top here. You could pretty much use anything you want. I'm doing rosemary, olive oil, and the coarse sea salt. I have the oven preheating at 350 degrees, and then I'm going to throw this in here as soon as the oven comes up to temperature. Be back in a minute. All right, this has been in the oven about 20 minutes or so. I had it on 350 degrees, and I had it in a convection oven. So you really just need to kind of keep an eye on it, and maybe even rotate it in the oven depending on your oven. But once it's done, you'll be able to tell, when it's the color that you want. So I'm going to take it off the mat here with a spatula. We're going to cut it up. You also might want to be careful when I had this on the mat and on the tray. You might want to use a slightly larger tray if it's the first time you're making it, because you don't want the oil pouring off and spilling over into the oven. You can use a knife. I'm just going to cut this into strips with a pizza cutter. This is still hot. You also might want it to cool off a little bit, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to cut this into strips. You can see it's nice and airy inside. You can feel some of the oil there. And I just pulled the second one out, the one with the garlic, olive oil and rosemary. I'm going to put the spatula underneath here to get this cut. We're just going to cut this into strips. This is still hot. I really should make it cool a little bit, but in the interest of time, I'm just cutting into it now. Last one I used the pizza cutter. It is actually easier to use a 12-inch chef knife to cut into it. So that's what I'm doing with this one. Even though there's oil on this bread, this is still good to dip into oil that's seasoned with hot pepper flakes or anything else that you like, or just straight olive oil. Also, because of the way the dough rises the second time on the tray, you can see this is a little bit thicker. You could push the dough out thinner on the tray if you don't want the dough as thick. I like it to kind of be like a bread, a thicker piece of bread. I'm not going to eat it like with a sandwich bread, and I still like it thick like this that I could break off and dip into olive oil when I eat it. There you have it.